In the climate-controlled vault beneath the British Museum, there exists a fragment of clay no larger than a human hand. Catalogue number K3454, Assyrian, 7th century BC. The surface is covered in wedge-shaped impressions, cuneiform script pressed into wet clay nearly 3,000 years ago, then baked hard by fire. The tablet is cool to the touch, dense, surprisingly heavy for its size. The text preserved on this fragment tells a story that should be impossible. It describes the moment when a divine being, a creature the Mesopotamians called Anzu, stole something from the god Enlil, not wealth, not territory, not worshippers or temples or offerings. Anzu stole a specific object the text called the Tablet of Destinies, and in that moment of theft, according to the ancient scribe who pressed these symbols into clay, the entire cosmic order collapsed. The gods, the text says, became powerless, unable to perform their functions, unable to govern, unable even to decree fate, because the authority they wielded, the very capacity to rule, was not inherent to their nature. It was contained in an object that could be stolen, an object that, the text carefully specifies, Enlil had been entrusted with, but did not ultimately own. Which raises a question the tablet never answers. If the Anunnaki, these beings the Sumerians described as gods, needed a physical device to exercise authority, and if that device could be taken from them, then who made the rules they were operating under? This is a video about laws, not the laws gods gave to humans. The laws gods had to follow themselves. And if you're settling in for the night, whether you're listening from Tokyo or Toronto, Oslo or Austin, leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're hearing this, because what we're about to explore comes from clay tablets scattered across museums on every continent, and there's something fitting about that global distribution. These texts were never meant to be mythology. They read like administrative records, procedural documentation, the minutes of meetings held by beings who, despite their power, operated within a framework they did not create. The British Museum fragment is only one piece of a much larger archive. Across institutions in Istanbul, Baghdad, Philadelphia and Berlin, thousands of cuneiform tablets preserve a remarkably consistent account of how the Anunnaki functioned, who could make decisions, who could overrule whom, what actions required committee approval, what authorities were territorial, what happened when protocols were violated. The myth of Anzu, the narrative preserved on K3454, and dozens of related tablets, is not presented as allegory or moral fable. It is documented as an event, a crisis. The text describes the specific location where the theft occurred, the chamber where Enlil performed his ablutions, the moment when he removed the Tablet of Destinies and set it aside. Anzu, who had been stationed as a guardian, saw the opportunity. The tablet describes his reasoning. With this object, he could decree the destinies himself. He could command the Anunnaki. But here is what makes the account remarkable. The text specifies that Anzu's theft worked. The gods actually lost their functional authority. They convened an emergency assembly. The text uses the Sumerian term Ukin-Iln, the assembly of the gods, and discussed the crisis. Multiple deities were asked to retrieve the tablet. Multiple deities refused, because without the Tablet of Destinies, even attempting to confront Anzu was legally meaningless. They could issue no binding commands. Their words carried no weight. Eventually, Ninurta, the warrior god, accepted the task. But the text is careful to note that even Ninurta could not simply attack Anzu and reclaim the tablet through force. He needed authorization from the assembly. He needed strategic advice from He needed specific weapons. And when he finally succeeded, the Tablet of Destinies was not returned to him as a reward. It was returned to Enlil, because the tablet, the text implies, belonged to a position, not a person. This is the world Sumerian cuneiform opens to us, not a pantheon of omnipotent beings doing whatever they wished, but a complex hierarchy operating under regulations that predated any individual god's authority. The word the Sumerians used most frequently to describe these regulations was me, pronounced may. The concept has no exact English equivalent. Scholars translate it variously as divine decree, cosmic principle, office or power, but the Sumerian texts treat the me as physical objects, things that could be counted, listed, transferred from one deity to another, stolen, lost, guarded in specific locations. One tablet, catalogued as ETCSL 1.3, one by the Oxford Electronic Text Corpus of Sumerian Literature, preserves a narrative about the goddess Inanna travelling to the city of Eridu to visit the god Enki. Enki, the text says, was the keeper of the me. During a feast, while Enki was intoxicated, Inanna convinced him to give her more than 60 me. The text lists them by name: kingship, priesthood, truth, descent into the underworld, the art of metalworking, the art of lovemaking, sexual allure, the giving of judgments. Each me is named individually, suggesting they were distinct, catalogued and regulated. When Enki sobered and realised what he had done, he sent servants to intercept Inanna's boat and retrieve the me, not because he was angry at her personally, but because, the text implies, the transfer had violated proper procedure. The me belonged to the cosmic order. They had designated functions and designated guardians. Enki could not simply give them away, even if he wanted to. Inanna kept them. She delivered them to her city, Uruk, and the text records no divine punishment for this act, which tells us something important. Once a transfer of me was completed through the proper ritual form, even if that form had been manipulated, it was binding, even on the gods. This is not how mythology typically works. Myths are fluid, symbolic, open to reinterpretation. But the Sumerian tablets read more like legal documents. They specify procedures. They document violations. They record consequences that follow from those violations with mechanical consistency. The Atrahasis epic, a Babylonian text preserved on tablets dating to the 17th century BC, provides the most detailed account of how the Anunnaki made group decisions. The narrative begins with a problem. The junior gods, called the Igigi, are exhausted from the labour of maintaining the earth. They are digging canals, dredging rivers, building infrastructure for a world that does not yet have humans to do this work. The text says they carried the work basket for 40 years. Then they rebel, but they do not rebel chaotically. They organise, they appoint a leader, they march to the dwelling of Enlil, the chief executive of the earth domain, and they demand a hearing. The text records their words: every single one of us gods has declared war. The work is too hard, the distress too much. Enlil does not simply command them back to work. He cannot. Instead he convenes the assembly. The text specifies who attended: Anu, the sky god; Enki, the god of the subterranean waters; the Anunnaki, the great gods who decree destinies. Enlil presents the problem to this council. The Igigi have stopped working. The Earth's systems are failing. The solution they arrive at, creating humans to bear the workload, is decided by committee vote. The text says they answered yes. In the assembly, the great Anunnaki who assign the fates, not unanimous acclamation, a vote. With a specific procedure, the question was posed, and the assembly gave formal assent. But even after the vote, there are constraints on implementation. Enki is tasked with the creation of humans, but he cannot do it alone. He requires the assistance of the goddess Nintu. He requires a specific material, the flesh and blood of a slain god, mixed with clay. The text is precise about this. It names the god who was slaughtered, Weila, one of the rebels. It describes the ritual, the ingredients, the incantations, the number of birth goddesses who participated. And throughout, the text emphasizes that this was not merely a creative act, it was a regulated procedure, a solution implemented within guidelines that even the Anunnaki could not bypass. What becomes clear, reading these texts in sequence, is that the Anunnaki were not depicting themselves as the ultimate source of cosmic law. They were administrators within a system. Powerful administrators, yes, capable of extraordinary actions, but bound by protocols they did not establish. The question the tablets never directly address is the question that pulls us deeper into this investigation. If the Anunnaki followed laws, where did those laws come from? Who or what stood above them when the gods made laws for themselves? The Sumerian language has 3 distinct terms for different classes of divine beings. This is not poetic variation, it is taxonomic precision. The word Dingir refers to gods in general, any divine entity. But within this broad category, the texts carefully distinguish between the Anunnaki, the Igigi, and a third group sometimes called the Anunna. Early translators assumed these were simply different names for the same beings, but careful reading reveals they held different ranks, performed different functions, and operated under different restrictions. The Igigi appear in texts as labourers. They are gods, but they work. They dig canals, they dredge rivers, they maintain the physical infrastructure of the cosmos. The Atrahasis epic is explicit about their subordinate status. When they rebel against their workload, they do not approach Anu or Enlil as equals. They come as petitioners. They make demands, but they cannot simply enact change. They require the Anunnaki to convene and rule on their complaint. The Anunnaki, by contrast, are described as the gods who decree fates. This phrase appears hundreds of times across Mesopotamian literature. It is their defining characteristic. But the texts are careful to specify that not all Anunnaki had equal authority in this function. Some decrees required unanimous consent of the full assembly. Others could be issued by smaller councils. And some powers were vested in specific positions that multiple gods could hold over time. Anu, whose name means heaven, held ultimate sovereign authority, but even Anu did not act unilaterally. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic preserved on 7 tablets now held in the British Museum, describes a moment when Anu's authority was challenged. The primordial goddess Tiamat raised an army to destroy the younger gods. The Anunnaki convened to decide how to respond. Multiple gods were offered the opportunity to lead the defence. Multiple gods refused. Then Marduk, son of Ea, made an offer. He would defeat Tiamat, but only if the assembly granted him permanent supremacy over the other gods. The text records the deliberation. The gods were reluctant. They valued their autonomy, but they agreed to a test. They created a constellation, the text calls it a garment, and commanded Marduk to destroy it with his word, then recreate it. Marduk spoke. The constellation vanished. He spoke again. It reappeared. The assembly, witnessing this demonstration of power, voted to grant Marduk the authority he demanded. This is a constitutional moment. The transfer of supreme executive power through a formal procedure, with conditions attached and consent required. Marduk did not seize power, he negotiated for it. And the negotiation was documented, clause by clause, in a text that Babylonian priests recopied for more than 1,000 years. But here is what the Enuma Elish reveals in its careful political language. Even after Marduk gained supremacy, he did not gain unlimited power. The other gods retained their domains. E still governed the Abzu, the freshwater realm beneath the earth. Ishtar still controlled the Mi related to warfare and sexuality. Shamash still administered justice for humans. What Marduk gained was supreme executive authority, the power to coordinate, to command in crisis, to make binding decisions when the assembly could not reach consensus. He became, in effect, the chief executive of a divine government. The Anunna, the third category of divine beings, are more difficult to define. They appear in texts as judges in the underworld, as witnesses to oaths, and as enforcers of cosmic boundaries. Some scholars believe they were originally a separate pantheon, later subordinated to the Anunnaki through political or theological merger. Others argue they represent a functional category, gods whose specific duty was maintaining the cosmic order rather than executing policy. What matters for our investigation is that the Sumerian and Akkadian scribes maintained these distinctions consistently across centuries of texts. They did not treat all gods as interchangeable. They documented hierarchy, jurisdiction, and procedural limitations with the precision of legal scholars. The clearest evidence for this comes from territorial divisions that were treated as inviolable. The poem Enki and the World Order, catalogued as ETCSL 1.1, 3 in the Oxford Corpus, describes how Enki travelled across the earth, assigning each region to a specific deity and establishing the me that would govern that place. He went to Sumer and decreed that it would be a land of abundance. He went to Elam and assigned it foreign status. He went to the Tigris and Euphrates rivers and appointed gods to manage their flow. But the text is careful to note that Enki himself did not have unlimited authority to make these assignments. He was executing a plan that had been decided by the assembly. His role was implementation, not invention. And once the assignments were made, they were binding on all the gods, including Enki himself. This becomes important when we examine a later text, Inanna's descent to the underworld. Inanna, the goddess of love and war, decides to visit the realm of her sister Ereshkigal, the queen of the dead. The text describes Inanna adorning herself with all her divine powers, the me she had acquired from Enki, and approaching the gates of the underworld. But at each of the 7 gates, the gatekeeper stops her. He tells her that to enter the underworld, she must remove one of her divine powers at each gate. This is not negotiable. It is not punishment. It is protocol. The laws of the underworld require that anyone entering, even a goddess of Inanna's rank, must surrender their powers progressively until they stand naked and powerless before Ereshkigal. Inanna complies, because she has no choice. The rules of territorial jurisdiction are absolute. When she finally stands before Ereshkigal, the underworld judges, the Anunna of that realm, pass judgment on her. They fix the eye of death upon her. She dies. Her corpse is hung on a hook, and only through the intervention of Enki, who creates special beings not subject to the underworld's laws, is she eventually rescued and revived. The story is often interpreted as a myth about death and rebirth, seasonal cycles, or the humbling of pride. But read as procedural documentation, it reveals something else. Even the most powerful Anunnaki could not violate territorial boundaries without consequences. The underworld had its own jurisdiction, its own regulations, its own judges who enforced those regulations even against one of the supreme deities. This suggests that the cosmic order was not centered on persons, but on positions, on offices that held specific authorities regardless of who occupied them. The Tablet of Destinies functioned the same way. Multiple texts refer to it. The myth of Anzu, the Enuma Elish, fragments of Assyrian royal inscriptions. In every version, the tablet is described as a physical object that confers the power to decree binding fates. Whoever holds it can issue commands that the cosmos must obey. In the Enuma Elish, the primordial goddess Tiamat gives the tablet to Kingu, elevating him to commander of her forces. The text says, "She gave him the tablet of destinies, fastened on his breast. Your utterance shall be unalterable, your word shall be law." When Marduk defeats Kingu, he takes the tablet and presents it to Anu, who confirms Marduk's supremacy by allowing him to retain it. But the critical detail is that the tablet could be transferred. It was not intrinsically bonded to any one god. The authority it represented was positional, not personal. This becomes even clearer in the Anzu myth. When Anzu steals the tablet from Enlil, the other gods lose their capacity to function effectively. The text says that without the tablet, Enlil could not perform his duties. The regular functioning of the cosmos stalled. The gods convened in emergency session, but even their deliberations were hampered, because binding decrees could not be issued without the tablet's authority. Ninurta is eventually chosen to retrieve it. but the text describes a lengthy process of authorization. Ninurta cannot simply go. He must be commissioned by the assembly. He must receive counsel from Ea on how to defeat Anzu, because Anzu now wields the tablet's power and can neutralize conventional attacks. Ea instructs Ninurta to use a specific weapon, the Shurur mace, and to strike when Anzu attempts to issue a decree using the tablet, at the moment when his mouth is open and he is vulnerable. The detail is fascinating. Even the power of the Tablet of Destinies has a procedural limitation. Decrees must be spoken, and in the instant of speaking, the holder is exposed. Ninurta succeeds. He reclaims the tablet, but the text records that he does not keep it. He returns it to Enlil, restoring the proper order, because the tablet belongs to the office of supreme governance, not to whoever is strong enough to hold it. What emerges from these accounts is a picture of divine authority as modular and regulated. The Anunnaki were immensely powerful, but their power was expressed through offices, objects, and procedures that existed independently of them. They could gain authority by occupying certain positions. They could lose authority if the tokens of that power were taken, and they could not act outside their jurisdictional boundaries without suffering consequences. The system resembles nothing so much as constitutional government, checks and balances, separation of powers, procedural requirements that apply even to the highest authorities. But constitutional governments require a constitution, a founding document or framework that establishes the rules everyone agrees to follow. The Sumerian texts never describe the origin of this framework. They take it as given. The me already exist. The territorial divisions are already established. The assembly procedures are already in place. The gods administer the system, but they did not create it. Which returns us to the question that will drive the rest of this investigation. If the Anunnaki inherited a system of cosmic law, who created it? Where did the me come from? Who established the jurisdictional boundaries and the procedural requirements that even the gods had to respect? The tablets do not answer directly, but they preserve clues, and those clues suggest something far stranger than the idea that gods once walked the earth. They suggest that the gods themselves were operating under a governance structure whose origins they did not fully understand. The ME, Cosmic Operating System. In the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago, there is a clay tablet catalogued as A7739. Sumerian, early dynastic the third period, approximately 2600 BCE. The surface is covered in archaic cuneiform, pictographic signs that predate the fully abstract wedge writing of later periods. The tablet is a list, not a poetic composition, not a hymn or prayer, a list. It enumerates items called me. There are more than 60 entries, though the tablet is damaged and some are illegible. Each entry is brief, one or two signs. Kingship, godship, the noble crown, the throne of kingship, truth, descent into the underworld, ascent from the underworld, the art of the hero, the giving of judgments, the making of decisions. The list continues: the eunuch priesthood, the cult prostitute, the sword and club, love-making, the sceptre, standards, the shrines, tending the gods, attention-seeking, music, eldership, heroship, power, treachery, the rebel land, kindness, terror, strife, peace, weariness, trouble, judgment, triumph. To a modern reader, the list seems chaotic, abstract concepts mixed with physical objects, virtues listed alongside weapons, religious offices beside emotional states. But to the Sumerians who compiled this catalogue, the me were not abstract at all. They were things, components of reality that could be possessed, transferred and lost. The fullest account of how the me functioned comes from the narrative poem Inanna and Enki, which describes the goddess Inanna's journey to Eridu to visit Enki, the god of wisdom and keeper of the me. The text, ETCSL 1.3.1 in the Oxford Electronic Text Corpus, presents the story as a kind of heist narrative, but beneath the plot is a detailed accounting of what the me were and how they could be transferred. The story begins with Inanna deciding to visit the Abzu, Enki's domain beneath the earth. She travels there, and Enki, pleased by her visit, prepares a feast. They drink beer together. The text specifies that they drank from bronze vessels filled to the brim. As Enki becomes intoxicated, he begins offering Inanna gifts. But these are not ordinary gifts. Each time he offers her a group of me, the text records the transaction with legal precision. Enki says, "In the name of my power, in the name of my Abzu, I shall give them to holy Inanna." Then he lists the me he is giving: the holy priesthood, the holy shrine, godship, the noble and enduring crown, the throne of kingship. Inanna accepts. The text says, "She took them." This phrase, "she took them," appears after each group of me Enki offers. It is not poetic variation. It is confirmation that the transfer was completed. Each offer and acceptance forms a binding transaction. The poem records Enki making this offer 14 times, transferring more than 60 me to Inanna. She accepts each group. And then, before Enki can reconsider, she loads the me onto her boat, the boat of heaven, and departs for Uruk. When Enki sobers, he asks his servant Isimud where the me have gone. Isimud tells him, "You gave them to your daughter." Enki is alarmed, not because he regrets giving gifts to Inanna, but because the me are not his personal property to give away. He is their keeper, their administrator, but the transfer Inanna has completed may violate the protocols that govern how me are supposed to be distributed. Enki sends Isimud and a group of monsters to intercept Inanna's boat and retrieve the me. The text describes 6 attempts. Each time, the creatures overtake Inanna's boat. Each time, they demand the return of the me. And each time, Inanna's vizier Ninshuba drives them back. Finally, Inanna reaches Uruk. She unloads the me at the quay. The text says she presented them, one after another, to the city. And once this presentation is complete, Enki's attempts to reclaim the me cease. Because, the text implies, the transfer is now irrevocable. The me have been formally delivered to their new location. The cosmic order has been updated. What does this tell us about the nature of the me? First, they were physical. Inanna loaded them onto a boat. She transported them across water. When she arrived in Uruk, she unloaded them and presented them to the city. The text treats the me as tangible objects that existed in space and could be moved. Second, they were regulated. Enki could not simply destroy the me or hoard them indefinitely. He was their keeper, but he administered them according to protocols. His attempt to reclaim them from Inanna was not based on personal ownership, but on procedural correctness. And once Inanna completed the proper ritual of presentation, even Enki accepted that the transfer was legitimate. Third, they were discrete and countable. The text lists them individually. Each me had a specific identity and function. Kingship was distinct from priesthood. The art of lovemaking was distinct from the art of war. They could be grouped, but they remained individual components. Fourth, they empowered whoever possessed them. Inanna's acquisition of the me transformed her status. She became the goddess who held powers over civilization that had previously been concentrated in Eridu under Enki's administration. Uruk, her city, became the centre of culture and kingship, not through military conquest, through the legal transfer of me. The poem Enki and the World Order provides additional context. This text describes Enki touring the earth and assigning me to various locations and deities. He goes to Sumer and establishes its me, abundance, craftsmanship, prosperity. He goes to the land of Dilmun and assigns it the me of trade. He appoints goddesses to oversee weaving, metalwork, and agriculture. He assigns gods to manage rivers, mountains, and seas. But throughout this assignment process, the text emphasizes that Enki is implementing a plan, not inventing one. The me exist prior to his distribution of them. His role is organizational. He is ensuring that each domain has the me it requires to function. This raises a critical question. Where did the me come from originally? The texts never say. They describe the me being held by Enki in the Abzu. They describe them being transferred, stolen, or redistributed. but they never describe their creation. The me are simply present in the cosmic order, like laws of physics or mathematical principles. The gods administer them, but they did not author them. The Akkadian term for me is Peru, which translates roughly as divine ordinance or right. In Akkadian texts, the Peru are described as the mechanisms through which divine will is enacted in the physical world. A ritual performed correctly, with the proper Peru invoked, compels the god associated with that Peru to incarnate in the ritual. The god has no choice. If the Peru is executed properly, the deity must appear. This is not how gods are typically understood to function. Gods are supposed to be sovereign, free to answer prayers or ignore them, to bless or withhold blessing. But the Peru system suggests something different. It suggests that divine beings were bound by protocols that operated mechanically. If the correct procedure was followed, the god was obligated to respond. Mesopotamian priests understood this. Temple rituals were not supplications, they were invocations. The priests were not asking the gods to appear, they were activating the Peru that required the gods to appear. This is why temple procedures were guarded so carefully, why precise language, exact gestures, and specific materials were required. The rituals were not symbolic, they were operational. They accessed a system that governed divine behaviour, and that system, the me, the Peru, was not created by the gods. They inherited it. They worked within it. They could transfer elements of it, as Enki transferred me to Inanna. They could lose access to it, as Enlil temporarily lost the Tablet of Destinies. But they could not alter its fundamental structure. Consider what this implies. If the me were natural laws, like gravity or thermodynamics, then we could understand them as inherent features of reality that the gods discovered and learned to manipulate. But the texts do not describe them that way. The me are described as decrees, decisions, structured protocols with specific jurisdictions and functions. If the me were cultural inventions, human projections of social order onto the divine realm, then we would expect them to vary by city-state, to reflect the political priorities of whoever was telling the story. But the me appear consistently across centuries of Sumerian and Akkadian literature. The same catalogue, with minor variations, is referenced in texts from Uruk, Nippur, Babylon, and Nineveh. The me function like software, a cosmic operating system that governs how reality works, how power can be exercised, and how transformations occur. The gods had high-level access to this system. They could execute commands that humans could not, but they did not write the code. They administered an infrastructure that predated them, and that infrastructure had safeguards. The Tablet of Destinies was the master access device. Whoever held it could issue decrees that the cosmos had to obey. But as the Anzu myth demonstrates, the tablet could be stolen, which means the system had a vulnerability, a single point of failure that could compromise the entire governance structure. Why would a perfectly designed system have such a vulnerability? Unless the system was not designed by the Anunnaki at all, unless it was designed by someone or something that wanted the Anunnaki to have power, but not absolute power. Enough authority to govern, but with built-in limitations that prevented any single entity from becoming unaccountable. The me system functioned as constitutional constraints. The gods could wield enormous power, but only within their assigned domains, only through the proper procedures, only by invoking the correct me. Inanna could not simply decide to rule over the Abzu. That domain belonged to Enki, and the me governing it were his to administer. She could acquire me through legitimate transfer, as she did when Enki gave them to her, but she could not seize them by force. Enlil could not simply decree fates without the Tablet of Destinies. The tablet was required to make his decrees binding. When it was stolen, his authority became symbolic but not functional. Ninurta could not enter the underworld and retrieve Inanna's corpse, even though he was one of the most powerful warrior gods. The underworld had its own me, its own jurisdiction, and its own judges. Ninurta had no authority there. The system was robust, distributed, and self-enforcing. Not because the gods chose to limit themselves, but because they were operating within an architecture that imposed those limits from outside. And here is where the investigation becomes genuinely strange. If we take the Sumerian texts at face value, if we treat them as records rather than mythology, then we are looking at documentation of a governance system whose designers are never named. The Anunnaki administer the me, but they did not create them. They hold positions of authority, but those positions exist independently of them. They can transfer power through specific objects and rituals, but they cannot alter the fundamental structure that governs how power works. This is not how religions typically develop. When humans invent gods, they tend to make those gods either omnipotent or capricious, unlimited in power or arbitrary in judgment. But the Anunnaki of the Sumerian texts are neither. They are constrained by a system that functions with legal and procedural precision, which suggests that the Sumerians were not inventing gods at all. They were documenting something they observed, something that presented itself as divine, but operated according to rules the Sumerians could study and record. The me were the visible interface of those rules, the access points through which divine power touched the physical world. And whoever designed that interface, whoever created the me system, understood governance, jurisdiction, and constitutional limits. They built a cosmos that could be administered, but not tyrannized. And then they gave the keys to the Anunnaki. Assembly of the Anunnaki, democratic oligarchy. The most revealing procedural document in the Mesopotamian archive is a text that scholars call the Atrahasis Epic, named after its human protagonist. The oldest copies date to the 17th century BC, but the narrative itself is much older. Linguists identify archaic Sumerian forms embedded in the Akkadian, suggesting the story was originally composed before 2500 BC and translated forward through successive languages and cultures. The epic begins not with humans, but with a labour dispute among the gods. The text describes a time when the Anunnaki had divided the cosmos into three domains. Anu took heaven, Enlil took the earth, and Enki took the Abzu, the freshwater realm beneath the surface. But maintaining these domains required constant work. Canals had to be dug to channel water, rivers had to be dredged to prevent flooding, mountains had to be shaped to create mineral deposits. The physical infrastructure of reality demanded labour. This labour was assigned to the Igigi, the younger gods. For 40 years, the text specifies the duration. They carried the work basket. They excavated the Tigris and Euphrates. They dug channels for irrigation. They built the foundations on which civilization would later rest. Then they refused to continue. The text describes them marching at night to the dwelling of Enlil, surrounding his house and demanding relief. They burned their tools. They held what amounts to a strike, and they did so collectively, with organisation and leadership. Enlil's response is telling. He did not command them back to work. He did not threaten punishment. He did not assert hierarchical authority and demand obedience. Instead, he sent his vizier to summon the other senior gods. Anu descended from heaven. Enki rose from the Abzu, and the three of them convened an assembly. The text records the procedural language. Anu made his voice heard and spoke to the gods, his brothers. What are we accusing them of? Their work was heavy, their distress was much. This is not the language of absolute monarchy, this is the language of parliamentary debate. Anu acknowledges the legitimacy of the Igigi's complaint. He frames the issue as a problem requiring collective solution, not individual command. Enlil proposes a solution: create a new class of beings, humans, to bear the labour. But even this proposal cannot be implemented by executive order. It must be voted on. The text says, they called the goddess, asked the midwife of the gods, wise Mami, you are the birth goddess, creatrix of mankind. Create a human that he may bear the yoke. Let him bear the yoke, the work of Enlil, let man carry the toil of the gods. Mami agrees, but she specifies that she cannot do this alone. She requires the cooperation of Enki, the god of wisdom, to devise the procedure, and she requires a specific material, the flesh and blood of a god, mixed with clay. An assembly vote is taken. One of the Igigi rebels, a god named Wei-Ila, whom the text identifies as having rationality, is selected for sacrifice. The rationale is not explained. Perhaps he was a ringleader, perhaps he volunteered. The text simply records that he was slain before the full assembly. His flesh and blood were mixed with clay. 14 birth goddesses shaped 14 lumps of the mixture, 7 male, 7 female. Incantations were spoken, and from this ritual the first humans were formed. But here is what matters for understanding Anunnaki governance. The decision to create humanity was not made by a single god. It required convening the assembly. It required debate. It required a formal vote. And it required the cooperation of multiple deities, each contributing their specific expertise to implement the decision. This pattern repeats throughout Mesopotamian literature. Major decisions, especially decisions that affect the structure of reality, are made collectively, not individually. In the Enuma Elish, when Tiamat threatens to destroy the younger gods, the response is not immediate military action. The gods convene. They debate who should lead the counterattack. Multiple gods decline. Then Marduk offers to take the role, but only if the assembly grants him permanent supremacy. The text describes a formal negotiation. Marduk's terms are presented. The gods deliberate. They test his power by commanding him to destroy and recreate a constellation through spoken word alone. He succeeds, and only then do they vote to grant him the authority he demanded. The language is precise. They founded a lord chamber for Marduk. Facing his fathers, as king he took his seat. You are honoured among the great gods. Your destiny is unequalled. Your command is Anu. From this day your command shall not be altered. To elevate and to abase shall be in your power. This is a constitutional transfer of authority. Marduk is granted the power to command, but the grant comes from the assembly. His authority is legitimate because it was conferred through proper procedure, and even after Marduk becomes supreme, the assembly continues to function. Later in the Enuma Elish, when Marduk proposes creating Babylon as the earthly seat of divine governance, he presents the plan to the Anunnaki. They approve it. They participate in its construction. The text describes them working collectively to build the temple Esagila brick by brick. This is not symbolic. The message is that even the supreme executive requires the consent and cooperation of the governed. The Eridu Genesis, the Sumerian flood narrative, provides the most dramatic example of assembly dynamics. The text is fragmentary, but enough survives to reconstruct the sequence. Humanity has multiplied. The noise of their cities disturbs the gods. Enlil proposes a solution: send a flood to destroy humanity and restore silence. The text records that the proposal is brought before the assembly of the Anunnaki. Most of the gods agree. The decision is made. The flood will be sent. But Enki dissents. He does not have the votes to overturn the decision, but he is not bound to cooperate with its execution. So he employs what we might call a legal workaround. He cannot warn humanity directly that would violate the assembly's decree, but he can speak to a reed wall. And if the human Atrahasis happens to be sleeping next to that reed wall and overhears Enki's words, that is not technically a violation. Enki tells the reed wall to instruct Atrahasis to build a boat, to load it with animals and provisions, and to survive the coming flood. Atrahasis obeys. He survives. Humanity is preserved. When the flood recedes and the gods discover that humans have survived, Enlil is furious. He accuses Enki of betrayal. But Enki's defense is procedural. I did not reveal the secret of the great gods. I let Atrahasis see a dream, and he heard the secret of the gods. This is lawyering. Enki exploited a technicality. He adhered to the letter of the assembly's decree while subverting its intent. And remarkably, his defence is accepted. The assembly does not punish him. Instead, they negotiate a new arrangement. Humanity will be allowed to survive, but controls will be placed on population growth to prevent the noise problem from recurring. The resolution is formalized, new decrees are issued, and the cosmic order continues under revised parameters. What we are witnessing in these texts is not autocracy, it is oligarchic constitutionalism. Power is distributed among a council of high-ranking deities. Major decisions require assembly approval. Dissent is permitted. Legal manoeuvring is possible. And once a decision is formalised through proper procedure, it becomes binding on all parties, even those who voted against it. This system has clear parallels to historical human governments, the Roman Senate, the Athenian Assembly, the constitutional monarchies of early modern Europe. But the Sumerian texts predate all of these by millennia. They describe a governance model that should not exist in Bronze Age literature, unless the Sumerians were not inventing a political model, unless they were documenting one they observed. The assembly procedures described in Mesopotamian texts are too consistent, too detailed, and too procedurally sophisticated to be purely symbolic. The texts specify who has standing to call an assembly, who must attend, what constitutes a quorum, how votes are taken, what happens when decisions are contested. In the myth of Anzu, when the Tablet of Destinies is stolen and divine governance collapses, the first action the gods take is to convene the assembly. They do not turn to a single leader. They gather collectively to deliberate. Multiple gods are asked to volunteer for the dangerous mission of confronting Anzu. Multiple gods refuse until Ninurta accepts. And even after Ninurta accepts, he does not act independently. He consults Ea for strategic advice. He receives authorization from the assembly. He is given specific instructions on which weapons to use. Only after all these procedural steps are completed does he engage Anzu in combat. When he succeeds, he returns the Tablet of Destinies to Enlil. He does not claim it for himself, even though he now has possession of the ultimate symbol of authority. Because the system is not based on personal power, it is based on positional authority that must be conferred and confirmed through proper channels. The assembly model reveals something crucial about Anunnaki society. Authority was legitimate only when it was procedurally correct. Power exercised outside proper channels was illegitimate, even if it was temporarily effective. Anzu's theft of the tablet gave him functional control over cosmic governance. He could issue decrees, he could command the other gods, but his authority was never legitimate. The text describes the gods refusing to accept his rule, even when they lacked the power to depose him. They recognized a distinction between raw power and lawful authority. This distinction is foundational to constitutional government. It is the principle that separates law from tyranny, and it appears fully formed in texts that are 4,000 years old. If the Sumerians invented this model as political allegory, they invented constitutional theory 2,000 years before Greek philosophy and 3,000 years before the Enlightenment. Or they documented a governance system they encountered, one that was already ancient when the first cities rose from the Mesopotamian plain. The assembly of the Anunnaki was not metaphor. It was the mechanism through which cosmic law was administered, and that mechanism operated according to rules that even the gods could not override. Jurisdictional boundaries. There is a moment in the Epic of Gilgamesh when the hero, grieving for his dead companion Enkidu, demands that the gods explain why death exists. He rages against the injustice of mortality. He journeys to the edge of the world seeking immortality, and at every stage of his quest, he encounters the same answer: death is not negotiable. It is not a punishment the gods can revoke or a curse they can lift. Death is jurisdictional. It belongs to a domain the sky gods cannot enter. The underworld, in Sumerian cosmology, was not hell. It was not a place of punishment for sin. It was a separate realm with its own governance, its own deities, and its own laws. The goddess Ereshkigal ruled there. The Anunnaki, judges of the dead, administered it, and the living gods had no authority within its boundaries. This jurisdictional separation was absolute. When Inanna descended to the underworld, she could not simply enter as a goddess. She had to pass through 7 gates. At each gate, a gatekeeper stopped her and demanded that she remove one of her divine powers. This was not robbery, it was protocol. The text of Inanna's descent, ECCSL 1.4.1, describes each gate encounter with the same formula. Inanna arrives. The gatekeeper bars her entry. She protests. The gatekeeper responds, "Be silent, Inanna. The divine powers of the underworld are perfect. They must not be questioned." At the first gate she removes her crown. At the second, her lapis lazuli necklace. At the third, her double strand of beads. At the fourth, her breastplate. At the fifth, her gold bracelet. At the sixth, the measuring rod and line. At the seventh, her royal robe. By the time she stands before Ereshkigal, she is naked and powerless. The me she accumulated, the divine authorities she wielded in the upper world, have been stripped away, because those authorities do not function in the underworld. Different rules apply there. When Ereshkigal and the Anunnaki judges fix the eye of death upon Inanna, she dies. A goddess dies. Not metaphorically. The text says her corpse is hung on a hook like meat. She is dead for 3 days and 3 nights. She is eventually rescued, but only through intervention that respects the underworld's jurisdiction. Enki creates 2 beings, neither fully alive nor dead, from dirt beneath his fingernails. These creatures are liminal. They can pass between realms because they do not fully belong to either. They enter the underworld, flatter Ereshkigal, and negotiate Inanna's release. But even this release comes with conditions. The laws of the underworld require a substitute. If Inanna leaves, someone must take her place. She is allowed to return to the surface only after her husband Dumuzi is sent down as her replacement. And even that substitution is later modified. Dumuzi and his sister will alternate 6 months in the underworld, 6 months above. The laws of the underworld cannot be overridden. They can only be satisfied through equivalent exchange. This is not storytelling. This is systems documentation. The text is describing how cosmic jurisdiction works. Different domains operate under different protocols, and those protocols cannot be bypassed even by the highest ranking deities. The same principle appears in Enki and the world order. In this text, Enki travels across the earth, assigning roles and authorities to various deities and regions. But his assignments are not arbitrary. He cannot give the me of abundance to a barren land, or the me of seafaring to a landlocked city. The me must match the territorial nature of the place. Geography constrains possibility. Enki assigns to Sumer the me of craftsmanship, agriculture, and kingship. He assigns to Meluha, the Indus Valley region, the me of trade and exotic resources. He assigns to Dilmun the me of purity and trade mediation. Each assignment reflects the inherent characteristics of the region. Enki is not creating these characteristics. He is formalizing them, assigning deities to administer territories according to their natural qualities. But his own authority has limits. When the goddess Inanna confronts him at the end of the poem, demanding to know why she has not been assigned a domain, Enki's response is telling. He does not say he forgot. He does not say she is unworthy. He lists the me she already possesses: warfare, sexuality, political power, the capacity to overturn order, and essentially argues that she has a unique role that transcends territorial jurisdiction. Whether Inanna accepts this explanation is unclear. The text ends without resolution, but the confrontation reveals that even Enki, the administrator of the me system, must justify his decisions. He cannot simply decree. He must operate within a framework where assignments can be questioned and justifications are required. Territorial boundaries were not merely geographical, they were legal. Crossing them without authorization was trespass, even for gods. The poem The Descent of Inanna emphasizes this. When Inanna decides to visit the underworld, she knows she is entering foreign jurisdiction. She tells her vizier Ninshubur to wait 3 days, and if she does not return, to go to the senior gods, Enlil, Nanna, and Enki, and beg them to intervene. When Inanna does not return, Ninshubur does exactly that. She goes first to Enlil. She explains that Inanna has been trapped in the underworld. She begs him to rescue her. Enlil refuses. The text records his words, "My daughter craved the great heaven, and so went down to the underworld. Inanna craved the great below, and so went down to the underworld." The divine powers of the underworld are divine powers which should not be approached. Whoever approaches them must be treated according to their laws. Ninshubur then goes to Nanna, Inanna's father. He also refuses, using nearly identical language. The underworld's laws must be respected. Finally, Ninshubur goes to Enki. Enki, the god of wisdom and boundary crossing, devises the plan using the liminal creatures that results in Inanna's rescue. But even Enki does not violate the underworld's jurisdiction. He does not march in and demand Inanna's release. He does not command Ereshkigal to free her. He sends emissaries who can navigate the boundary and negotiate within the underworld's legal framework. This respect for jurisdictional boundaries was not weakness. It was the foundation of cosmic stability. Each domain had its own authorities and its own rules. Violating those boundaries created chaos, not because the gods would fight each other, but because the cosmic order itself would break down. The Tablet of Destiny's theft illustrates this. When Anzu stole the tablet from Enlil, the immediate consequence was not military conflict. It was systemic failure. The gods lost the capacity to perform their functions. Rivers stopped flowing properly. Weather became erratic. The regular order of seasons and cycles faltered. Why? Because the Tablet of Destinies was not just a symbol of authority. It was the mechanism through which the protocols governing reality were maintained and updated. Without it, even simple divine actions could not be executed. Commands could not be issued in a way that the cosmos would recognize as binding. This suggests that cosmic governance was not based on the personal power of individual gods. It was based on their authorized access to a system. The me, the Tablet of Destinies, the territorial assignments that operated independently of them. A god's power within their jurisdiction was nearly absolute. Enki in the Abzu could reshape water, create new life forms, and manipulate the fundamental forces of fertility and wisdom. Enlil on the Earth's surface could command winds, direct storms, and dictate the rise and fall of kingdoms. Anu in heaven could decree the movements of stars and the succession of ages, but outside their jurisdictions, their power diminished to near zero. Enlil could not override Ereshkigal's judgment in the underworld. Enki could not command the stars. Anu could not directly intervene in human affairs without working through his designated representatives on Earth. The system was robust because it was distributed. No single point of failure could collapse the entire structure. Even the theft of the Tablet of Destinies, the most severe crisis documented in the texts, did not destroy cosmic order. It disrupted it. The gods lost efficiency and coordination, but the underlying structure persisted long enough for Ninurta to retrieve the tablet and restore proper function. This is sophisticated systems architecture. Redundancy, separation of concerns, jurisdictional boundaries that prevent cascading failures. It is the kind of design you would expect from engineers, not poets. And it raises a question that the Sumerian texts never directly address. If cosmic governance was designed with this level of sophistication, who did the designing? The Anunnaki clearly inherited the system. They administered it, but they did not create its foundational structure. The jurisdictional boundaries predated them. The me predated them. The territorial assignments were already in place when they took their positions, which means someone or something established the framework within which the Anunnaki operated. Someone created a cosmos that could be governed but not tyrannized. Someone built jurisdictional boundaries that even the gods had to respect. The Sumerians documented this system meticulously, but they never claimed to know where it came from, only that it was ancient beyond memory, and that it was still in effect. The prohibition against unregulated creation. The creation of humanity, as recorded in the Atrahasis epic, was not an act of spontaneous divine will. It was a bureaucratic solution to an infrastructure crisis, implemented through committee decision and requiring specific materials, procedures, and oversight. The text is precise about what happened and in what order. The Igigi gods had been labouring for 40 years. They rebelled. They surrounded Enlil's house and demanded relief. Enlil convened the assembly. The problem was presented. The work of maintaining the cosmos was too heavy for the divine workforce. A solution was proposed: create a new category of being to bear the burden. But this solution could not be implemented through executive order. The text describes multiple procedural requirements. First, the assembly had to vote. The text says they answered yes in the assembly, the great Anunnaki who assigned the fates. Not unanimous acclamation, not divine decree from on high. A vote, a formal expression of collective consent. Second, specific deities had to volunteer their expertise. The goddess Mami, also called Nintu or Belitili, was asked to serve as chief creatrix, but she immediately specified that she could not do it alone. She needed Enki's wisdom to devise the procedure. The text records her words: "It is not properly mine to do these things. The work is Enki's. He makes everything pure. If he gives me the clay, then I can do it." Third, specific materials were required. Not just any clay. Clay mixed with the flesh and blood of a god, and not just any god. The text specifies that one of the Igigi rebels, Wei-La, who possessed rationality, was selected. The assembly agreed to his sacrifice. He was slain before them. His body was processed. The goddess Nintu mixed his flesh and blood with clay. The text describes the proportions. It describes the incantations. It describes 14 birth goddesses, 7 for males, 7 for females, each shaping a portion of the mixture. The procedure took specific time. The gestation was 9 months, counted according to divine time, and at each stage the text emphasizes that this was not improvisation. The goddess Nintu followed a protocol. She recited specific words. She performed specific gestures. The creation of humanity was a ritual, executed according to regulations that governed how new forms of life could be brought into existence. This raises a critical question. Why did creating humans require such elaborate procedure? Why couldn't a single god simply speak humanity into being? The answer, implicit throughout Mesopotamian texts, is that unregulated creation was forbidden, perhaps impossible. The gods could not simply invent new categories of existence through raw power. They had to work within parameters established by the Mi system. The Mi governing creation, the Paru of life-giving, had specific requirements: raw materials from existing life forms, divine essence to provide animating consciousness, clay from the earth to provide physical form, incantation to bind the elements, ritual witness to formalize the act. Skip any step and the creation would fail, or worse, it would produce something unstable, something that violated cosmic order and threatened the integrity of the system. The Epic of Gilgamesh provides a contrasting case. When the goddess Ururu creates Enkidu, the wild man who will become Gilgamesh's companion, she follows a similar procedure. The text says she washes her hands, pinches off clay, and throws it into the wilderness. From this clay, Enkidu is formed. But Enkidu is not human in the same way the children of Mami's creation are human. He is a unique being, part human, part animal. He lives with gazelles. He drinks at watering holes with herds. He has no language, no culture, no awareness of civilization. It takes a second intervention, sexual union with a temple priestess, to transform Enkidu into a civilized human. The text describes this transformation in detail. After 7 days and nights with the priestess, Enkidu finds that the wild animals flee from him. He has become something different. The priestess tells him, "You are wise, Enkidu. You have become like a god." This transformation was not accidental. It followed a protocol. The priestess was not simply a woman. She was a hierodule, a sacred prostitute, someone who wielded one of the me that Inanna controlled, the me of sexual transformation. Through ritual intercourse, she transferred civilized humanity to Enkidu. What we are seeing in these accounts is a consistent principle, transformation of being, especially transformation that creates new categories or bridges existing categories, required invoking specific me through proper ritual procedure. The gods could not bypass this requirement. They had to work within it. This becomes even more explicit in texts dealing with divine parentage. Throughout Mesopotamian literature, gods have children with other gods and occasionally with humans, but these unions follow rules. When a god fathers a child with a human woman, the resulting offspring is not fully divine. The child is a demigod, possessing extraordinary abilities but subject to mortality. Gilgamesh is 2/3 divine, 1/3 human. His mother was the goddess Ninsun, his father the human king Lugalbanda. But his mixed nature creates a fundamental tension. He has divine strength and knowledge, but human mortality. The entire epic revolves around his futile quest to escape the 1/3 that condemns him to death. The text never explains why Gilgamesh is only 2/3 divine. Why not half? The specificity suggests a formula, a calculation based on the nature of divine essence and how it combines with human substance. This is not poetic license, this is measurement. In the Sumerian king list, the early rulers are described as having reigns of impossible length, tens of thousands of years, but their divine status is never explicitly stated. Instead, the text carefully specifies which kings were sons of gods and which were fully human. The distinction mattered. It determined their lifespan, their authority, and their relationship to the cosmic order. The transition from antediluvian kings who reigned for 28,800 years to post-flood kings who reigned for 625 years or less is not gradual. It is abrupt. The flood marks a boundary. Before it, something about the nature of kingship or the nature of humans or the rules governing their interaction was different. After it, new parameters applied. The Atrahasis epic explicitly describes a change in human nature after the flood. When the gods agreed to let humanity survive, they also agreed to impose limitations. The goddess Nintu declared new regulations. Some women would be barren, some infants would die, some demons would snatch babies, some priestesses would be forbidden to bear children. These were not curses. They were population controls built into the revised protocols governing human reproduction. The text presents this as a negotiated settlement. Humanity could continue existing, but only under new constraints. The gods would no longer tolerate unlimited population growth. Mechanisms were put in place to regulate human numbers. This is eugenics, population engineering, implemented not through natural selection, but through modifications to the me governing human fertility and mortality. If we take the text at face value, what we are reading is documentation of genetic or metaphysical modifications to human design parameters. Changes made by committee decision and implemented through procedures that required specific divine authorities to execute. Why would gods need committee approval to modify human nature? Why would they need specific procedures rather than simply willing the changes into existence? Because they were not operating as absolute creators. They were administrators working within a system that regulated what could be created, how it could be modified, and what authorities were required to authorize those modifications. The prohibition against unregulated creation appears throughout the mythological corpus as a background assumption. Gods do not casually create new life forms. When they do create, they follow procedures. They invoke authorities. They work through proper channels. In Enki and Ninmah, another creation narrative, the gods get drunk and begin a competition. Ninmah creates various defective humans, a blind man, a paralysed man, a sterile woman, and challenges Enki to find a place for them in society. Enki succeeds, assigning each one a role they can fulfill despite their limitations. Then Enki creates a being so defective, unable to eat, unable to stand, unable to control its bodily functions, that even Ninmah cannot find a use for it. The text presents this as Enki going too far, creating something that should not exist. Ninmah curses him for it. The story is often interpreted as explaining the origin of disability or defending the value of imperfect humans. But read procedurally, it is documenting the consequences of unauthorized modification. Enki, even in his wisdom, could create beings that violated proper parameters, and those violations had consequences, not cosmic catastrophe, but social disorder and divine censure. The system had guardrails. It tolerated variation within parameters, but resisted modification beyond them, and even the wisest of gods could trigger those resistances if they pushed too far. This suggests that the me system was not merely administrative, it was also protective. It prevented the gods from destabilizing reality through uncontrolled experimentation. It enforced consistency, it maintained the boundaries between categories of being, and it did so not through divine police force, but through built-in constraints. The procedures for creation required cooperation between multiple deities. No single god could create humans alone. Mami needed Enki's wisdom. Enki needed Mami's birth-giving capacity. Both needed the assembly's authorization. Both needed the sacrifice of Wela to provide divine essence. The system was designed to prevent unilateral action, which again raises the question, who designed it? If the Anunnaki inherited a cosmic order that prevented them from creating freely, who imposed those restrictions? And why? The texts never say, but they document the restrictions with legal precision. And those restrictions were still in force when the last cuneiform tablet was pressed in the 1st century of the Common Era. Thousands of years of consistency across Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian cultures. The rules governing creation did not change, as if they could not be changed, as if they were encoded too deeply in the fabric of reality for even the gods to rewrite them. Kingship, the interface between realms. In the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, there is a clay prism about 8 inches tall. It is known as the Weld-Blundell prism, catalogued as 1923.444. The object dates to approximately 2170 BCE, though the text it contains is far older. Each of its 4 sides is covered in tiny cuneiform script, 343 lines total. It is a king list, the Sumerian king list. The text begins with a statement that should be impossible. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu, not after kings arose from among humans, not when humans first organised into hierarchies. The kingship descended from heaven as a complete institution, transferred from one realm to another. The text then lists the first 8 kings who ruled before the flood. Their reigns are measured in years that make no biological sense. Alulim, the first king, ruled for 28,800 years. Alalya, his successor, ruled for 36,000 years. The 8 antediluvian kings together ruled for a total of 241,200 years. Then the flood came. The text says simply, then the flood swept over. After the flood, kingship descended from heaven again. But now the reign lengths are different. Joshua ruled for 1,200 years. Kulasina-Bel for 960 years. Still impossibly long by human standards, but dramatically shorter than the antediluvian pattern. As the list progresses through time, reign lengths continue to decrease. By the early dynastic period, around 2900 BCC, kings are ruling for recognisably human lifespans, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. Conventional scholarship treats these numbers as mythological exaggeration or as representing dynasties rather than individuals. But the text itself makes no such distinction. It presents each name as an individual ruler. It tracks succession from father to son, from conqueror to conquered, with the same format throughout. And it frames kingship as something that exists independently of any particular king. Kingship is not invented by Elulim. It is not seized by force. It descends from heaven and settles in Eridu. Then, when Eridu's priority ends, kingship moves to Bad Tibira. When Bad Tibira's time ends, it moves to Larug. The institution transfers between cities, but it remains intact, a single continuous office, passing through different holders. This concept of kingship as a transferable me is elaborated in other texts. The Code of Ur-Nammu, the oldest surviving law code, inscribed on tablet Ni 3191 in the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, begins with a prologue that frames the king's authority as divinely granted but conditionally held. The prologue says, when Anu and Enlil had given the kingship of Ur to Nanna, at that time did Ur-Nammu, the mighty warrior, king of Ur, king of Sumer and Akkad, establish justice in the land. The grammar is precise. Anu and Enlil gave the kingship to Nanna, the moon god of Ur. Nanna then delegated it to Ur-Nammu. The human king was not the direct recipient of divine authority. He was the operational agent of a god who held one of the me of kingship. This three-tier structure, supreme gods, local patron gods, human kings, appears consistently throughout Mesopotamian political theology. The human king ruled by delegated authority. He was the interface between divine government and human society. But this delegation came with terms. The prologue of Ur-Nammu's code lists the king's responsibilities, establish justice, eliminate enmity and violence, prevent the strong from oppressing the weak, ensure honest weights and measures in commerce. These were not suggestions. They were the terms of the kingship me. Fail to fulfill them, and the me could be withdrawn. The Curse of Agordaid, a Sumerian literary text, documents exactly such a withdrawal. The text describes how Naram-Sin, king of Akkad, offended the god Enlil by attacking the sacred city of Nippur. Enlil's response was not direct divine punishment. It was administrative. He withdrew the me of kingship from Akkad. The text says, Enlil, because his beloved Akur had been attacked, what should he destroy in return for the Akur having been destroyed? He lifted his gaze toward the mountains and brought down Gutium, a people who know no inhibitions. The Gutians, barbarians from the mountains, invaded Akkad. They destroyed the irrigation systems, they burned the cities, they ended Akkadian supremacy, and the text frames this not as military conquest, but as cosmic repossession. The me of kingship was taken from Akkad and dispersed. Akkad fell not because its armies were defeated, but because its authorization to rule was revoked. This pattern repeats throughout Mesopotamian history. Cities rose to prominence, ruled for a period, then declined. And the texts consistently frame these transitions as transfers of the kingship me from one city to another. The institution remained constant, only its location changed. What does this tell us about how the Anunnaki understood political authority? First, authority was not inherent to individuals. It was vested in offices. A king ruled not because of personal charisma or military strength, but because he held the me of kingship. Without that me, he was merely a powerful man, not a legitimate ruler. Second, the me of kingship could be transferred or withdrawn. The gods who administered it could reassign it based on performance, loyalty, or cosmic necessity. This made kingship conditional, a contract, not a permanent grant. Third, human kings served as intermediaries. They translated divine will into human action, but they did not originate that will. They were, in effect, licensed operators of a franchise. They could execute local policy within guidelines, but they could not alter the fundamental framework. This is a remarkably sophisticated model of political legitimacy. It separates the office from the person. It establishes performance criteria for rulers. It provides mechanisms for orderly transfer of power. And it grounds human authority in a cosmic order that transcends any individual or dynasty. If the Sumerians invented this model, they invented constitutional monarchy 3,000 years before Europe. They developed the concept of the divine right of kings, but with built-in limitations. The king's right was not absolute, and it could be revoked if he failed to fulfill his duties. Or they documented a system they observed, a system in which human rulers were, quite literally, representatives of a higher government, licensed, monitored, and replaceable. The Epic of Gilgamesh explores what happens when a king possesses the me of kingship, but uses it improperly. The text opens with a description of Gilgamesh's tyranny. He exhausts the young men with endless building projects. He claims the right to sleep with every new bride before her husband. He rules with arrogance and cruelty. The people pray for relief. The gods hear their prayers. They create Enkidu specifically to challenge Gilgamesh. Not to overthrow him, Enkidu does not claim kingship, but to check his power, to force him to become a better king. After Enkidu's death, Gilgamesh undergoes a transformation. He becomes obsessed with mortality. He journeys to find Utnapishtim, the flood survivor who was granted eternal life. Along the way, he meets a tavern keeper named Siduri, who tells him, "The life you pursue you shall not find. When the gods created mankind, death for mankind they set aside, life in their own hands retaining. This is not comfort, it is information. Human mortality was a design parameter, not a curse or a punishment, a specification built into the me governing human creation. Even a king, even 1/2/3 divine, could not override it." Gilgamesh eventually returns to Uruk, resigned to mortality but transformed in character. The text ends with him inspecting the walls of his city, taking pride in his lasting works. He has learned to rule as kings should, building for the future, creating infrastructure that will outlast his reign. The message is clear. Kingship is not about personal aggrandizement. It is about stewardship. The king holds the me of kingship temporarily. His duty is to maintain the cosmic order at the local level, justice, infrastructure, defense, proper ritual, so that when the me passes to his successor, the city remains intact. This understanding of kingship as delegated, conditional, and purposeful stands in sharp contrast to other ancient monarchical ideologies. In Egypt, the pharaoh was literally divine, a god incarnate. In China, the emperor held the mandate of heaven, which could be lost only through cosmic signs and catastrophic failure. In most ancient cultures, the king's authority was absolute or nearly so. But in Mesopotamia, the king was explicitly subordinate, not just to the gods in general, but to a specific legal framework administered by the gods. He could be evaluated, he could fail, he could be replaced. And the mechanism of evaluation and replacement was built into the system. It did not require revolution or divine intervention in the dramatic sense. It simply required the gods, or the cosmic order they administered, to reassign the me of kingship to a different city or ruler. The Sumerian king list documents this process over thousands of years. Kingship moved from Eridu to Bad Tibira, to Larug, to Sippar, to Shuruppak. Then the flood. Then from Kish to Uruk, to Ur, to Awan to Kish, again to Hamazi to Uruk again. Always moving, never permanently fixed. Each city that held kingship claimed continuity with the previous holders. Each new king performed rituals to formally receive the me from his predecessor or from the patron god of his city. The transfer was not automatic. It had to be enacted. And the fact that it had to be enacted tells us something crucial. The me of kingship was not an abstract concept. It was a tangible authority that could be held, transferred, and withdrawn, which again points to the question underlying all of this. If kingship was a me that descended from heaven, where did it exist before it descended? Who held it before the first human city? And who decided it was time to transfer it to human administration? The texts say the Anunnaki decided. They convened. They determined that humans needed governance. They assigned the me of kingship to descend. But even in that account, the Anunnaki were implementing a decision, not creating an institution. Kingship already existed as a concept, as a me, as a component of the cosmic operating system. They were merely extending it to a new domain, the human realm, which means kingship, like the other me, predated the Anunnaki's decision to apply it to humanity. The institution was older than its implementation. The framework was already built. The gods were once again administrators rather than inventors, and the humans who received delegated authority through the me of kingship were, in a very real sense, participating in a governance system that extended from their city to the divine realm, to something beyond even the gods. A hierarchy of delegated authority, each level operating under regulations established by the level above, all the way to a source the texts never name, laws against divine rebellion. In the British Museum's Assyrian collection, there exists a fragmentary tablet, catalogue number K3454, that preserves part of the Anzu myth. The fragment is small, badly damaged, and easy to overlook among the tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets in the collection. But the event it documents is perhaps the most revealing in all of Mesopotamian literature, a successful theft of supreme authority, and the cosmic crisis that resulted. Anzu was not originally a rebel. The texts describe him as a guardian, a divine servant stationed at the entrance to Enlil's chamber. His nature was hybrid, part eagle, part lion, a creature of immense power but subordinate status. He was trusted, given access, positioned close to the seat of power. Then he made a decision. The text records his reasoning: I will take the divine tablet of destinies, I myself, and control the decrees of all the gods. I will make firm my throne and be the controller of the me. I will direct the Igigi in their assignments. This is not mindless rebellion. This is calculated ambition. Anzu understood the system. He knew that authority did not flow from personal power, but from possession of the proper tokens. He knew that if he could seize the tablet of destinies, the other gods would be functionally compelled to obey him. And he was right. The text describes the moment of theft. Enlil was performing his morning ablutions. He removed the tablet of destinies and set it aside. Anzu seized it and fled to the mountains. Immediately, the cosmic order began to fail. The text says the divine decrees were suspended, stillness spread, silence prevailed. The Anunnaki were in dismay, not because they feared Anzu personally, but because without the tablet they could not perform their functions. Commands issued without the tablet's authority were meaningless. The cosmos did not recognize them as binding. Enlil convened an emergency assembly. He presented the crisis. He asked for volunteers to retrieve the tablet. The text lists multiple gods who were approached: Adad, the storm god; Jera, the fire god; Shara. Each declined. The text records their reasoning: who can go before Anzu? Who can get the tablet back? They were not being cowardly, they were being realistic. Anzu now held the tablet. He could issue decrees. Any god who attacked him could be neutralized with a word. The tablet gave him access to the same authorities the other gods wielded, but centralized. He had become functionally the supreme executive. Finally, Ninurta agreed to attempt the mission. But even Ninurta, the warrior god, patron of kings, slayer of demons, required extensive support. E, the god of wisdom, had to devise a strategy. The text describes Ea's advice in detail. Ea told Ninurta to watch for the moment when Anzu attempted to issue a decree using the tablet. At that moment, Anzu's mouth would be open. His concentration focused on speaking the words properly. That instant of vocalization was his vulnerability. Ninurta was instructed to strike then with specific weapons, severing Anzu's wings and incapacitating him before the decree could be completed. The plan worked. Ninurta struck in the moment of Anzu's vulnerability. Anzu fell. The tablet was retrieved. But the text is careful to note what happened next. Ninurta did not keep the tablet. He returned it to Enlil. The assembly confirmed Enlil's authority. The cosmic order was restored. This narrative reveals several crucial principles about how divine authority functioned and what happened when those principles were violated. First, supreme authority required possession of a physical object. The Tablet of Destinies was not a symbol, it was an access device. Whoever held it could interface directly with the cosmic operating system. They could issue decrees that reality had to obey. Second, possession of the tablet was sufficient to grant functional authority even to someone who was not authorized to hold it. Anzu's theft worked. The other gods could not simply override him. The system recognized the tablet, not the worthiness of the holder. Third, the tablet had a procedural vulnerability. Decrees had to be spoken, and the act of speaking created a momentary window during which the holder was exposed. This was not an accident. It was a built-in limitation. Even the supreme authority could not be exercised instantaneously or silently. It required vocalization, which created accountability and opportunity for intervention. Fourth, recovery of the tablet required strategic intelligence, not just raw power. E's wisdom was as essential as Ninurta's strength. The system valued intelligence and planning over brute force. Fifth, the tablet was returned to its proper holder. Ninurta's heroism was celebrated, but he did not claim the ultimate prize. The system did not reward successful violence with supreme authority. It restored proper order. These principles appear consistently across Mesopotamian accounts of divine rebellion and its consequences. In the Enuma Elish, the goddess Tiamat transferred the Tablet of Destinies to Kingu, elevating him to command her army against the younger gods. The text specifies that this transfer was formalized. She gave him the Tablet of Destinies, fastened on his breast, saying, "Your utterance shall be unalterable, your word shall be law." Kingu, now holding the tablet, became a legitimate threat. The younger gods could not simply dismiss his authority. They had to respond to it. Marduk had to negotiate for supreme executive power before engaging Kingu in battle. And even after defeating Kingu and reclaiming the tablet, Marduk had to present it to Anu for confirmation before his authority was fully recognized. The pattern is consistent. Possession of the tablet granted functional authority, but legitimate authority required proper transfer and assembly confirmation. What happens when a god rebels without seizing the tablet? When they simply refuse to fulfill their assigned duties? The Ajiji rebellion in the Atrahasis epic provides an example. The Ajiji gods stopped working. They burned their tools. They surrounded Enlil's house and demanded relief. This was open defiance of their assigned role. But the text describes no divine punishment, no bolts from heaven, no immediate retribution. Instead, Enlil convened the assembly to address their grievances. The rebellion was treated as a legitimate labour dispute requiring negotiation, not as a capital crime requiring execution. The solution was systemic. Create humans to assume the burden. The Ajiji were reassigned to lighter duties. The cosmic order was adjusted to prevent future such crises. This reveals something important. The system tolerated dissent. It provided mechanisms for addressing grievances. The Ajiji were not destroyed for their rebellion because their complaint was recognized as valid. They had been overworked. The solution was to redesign the work distribution, not to punish those who complained. But there were limits. Rebellion aimed at seizing authority, as Anzu attempted, triggered immediate crisis response. Rebellion based on legitimate grievance, as the Ajiji demonstrated, triggered negotiation. The system distinguished between types of dissent. It punished attempts to subvert the cosmic order while accommodating attempts to improve it. In Inanna and Enki, when Inanna took the me from a drunken Enki and fled to Uruk, Enki sent servants to retrieve them. Multiple attempts were made, but Inanna and her vizier Ninshubur successfully defended the me until they reached Uruk and formally presented them to the city. Once that presentation was complete, Enki stopped trying to retrieve the me. He accepted the transfer as binding. The text records no punishment for Inanna, no divine sanction. The transfer stood. Why? Because Inanna had followed a form of proper procedure. Enki had offered the me to her. She had accepted. She had transported them to her city. She had presented them publicly. Each step had been completed according to ritual form. Even though Enki had been drunk when he made the offer had been formalized. The cosmic order recognized the transfer as legitimate. This suggests that the laws governing divine behavior were procedural rather than moral. What mattered was not the intent or the ethics of an action, but whether it followed proper form. The system was legalistic. It evaluated actions based on compliance with protocol, not on subjective judgment of right and wrong. But violations of proper form had severe consequences. When Naram Sin, the human king of Akkad, attacked the sacred city of Nippur without divine authorization, Enlil's response was to withdraw the me of kingship from Akkad entirely. The Curse of Agade describes the result: famine, invasion, and total collapse. The text presents this as cosmic law enforcement. Nippur was sacred. Attacking it without authorization violated a jurisdictional boundary. The penalty was automatic: revocation of the authority that had been violated. In the descent of Inanna, when Inanna entered the underworld without following proper protocols, she was judged and executed by the Anunna judges of that realm. Her status as a great goddess did not protect her. She had violated territorial jurisdiction. The law of the underworld applied equally to all who entered. Her rescue was possible only because Enki found a procedural workaround, creating beings who could navigate between realms and negotiate her release. But even that release required a substitute. The law of the underworld demanded equivalent exchange. Someone had to remain if Inanna left. These accounts paint a picture of divine society governed by law in the strictest sense. Not law as suggestion or guideline, but law as mechanically enforced regulation. Actions had consequences that followed automatically from the nature of the violation, not from the anger or mercy of a judge. The gods could not simply forgive trespasses. They could find procedural solutions, as Enki repeatedly did, but they could not override the fundamental protocols. This raises a profound question. If the gods were subject to laws they could not override, who or what enforced those laws? The texts never describe a police force. They never mention divine enforcers who punish violations. Instead, the consequences seem to emerge from the structure of reality itself, violate proper procedure, and the cosmic order automatically responds. Not with judgment, but with mechanical adjustment. It is as if the me system included built-in safeguards, automatic responses to violations, self-correcting mechanisms that maintained cosmic stability regardless of individual divine actions. This is systems architecture at the highest level, not government by decree, but government by protocol, not enforcement by punishment, but enforcement by design. And it suggests once again that the Anunnaki were not the architects of the system they administered. They operated within it. They could manipulate it expertly, but they could not escape its constraints. Even successful rebellion, even temporary seizure of the Tablet of Destinies, was ultimately corrected by the system itself, because the system was designed to be self-restoring, robust against failure, resilient against attack. The question is, who designs a cosmos with such characteristics? Who builds self-correcting governance into the fabric of reality, and why make the gods subject to it rather than masters of it? The tablets document the constraints. They record the violations and the consequences, but they never explain who created the framework that made those constraints binding. Only that the framework was there, ancient, inviolable. operating according to principles that even the gods called laws. The flood decision, process and descent. The most complete account of divine decision-making in crisis appears in the Atrahasis epic. It documents a moment when the Anunnaki assembly voted to destroy all human life, and one god's decision to subvert that vote. The crisis developed gradually. Humanity had multiplied, cities grew, population expanded, and the noise, the texts are specific about this, became intolerable to the gods. Not metaphorical noise, not spiritual corruption, literal sound. The clamour of human cities disturbed the gods' rest. Enlil, whose domain was the earth's surface, and who therefore bore the brunt of this disturbance, brought a proposal to the assembly: eliminate humanity. Not through flood initially. First, he proposed sending plague. The assembly agreed. The plague was sent. Enki, the god of wisdom, whose relationship with humanity was more sympathetic, warned Atrahasis, the wisest human. Atrahasis organised the humans to propitiate Namtar, the plague demon. The plague was lifted. Humanity multiplied again. The noise returned. Enlil proposed drought. Again the assembly agreed. Again Enki warned Atrahasis. Again humanity found a solution, this time propitiating Adad, the storm god, to bring rain. Each time the pattern repeated. The assembly voted for a solution. Enki undermined it. Humanity survived. Finally, Enlil demanded a permanent solution. He proposed a flood that would destroy all terrestrial life. He bound the assembly with an oath. No god was to warn humanity. No god was to interfere with the execution of this final decree. The assembly voted. The text says the great gods assented to the decision, but the text does not record the vote as unanimous. It records assent, majority agreement, which implies dissent was possible, and indeed Enki dissented. The oath prevented Enki from warning humans directly, but the text describes his solution with evident admiration for its cleverness. He could not speak to Atrahasis, but he could speak to the wall of Atrahasis's reed house. And if Atrahasis happened to be sleeping on the other side of that wall, and happened to hear what Enki told the wall, that was not technically a violation of the oath. Enki told the wall to instruct Atrahasis to tear down his house, build a boat, abandon possessions, save his life, and bring aboard the seed of all living things. Specific dimensions for the boat, specific construction materials, specific timeline. Atrahasis obeyed. He built the boat exactly as specified. He loaded it with his family, craftsmen to preserve technical knowledge, and animals of every kind. The text is precise. He brought aboard all living beings that he had, all the wild beasts and all cattle, all the birds of heaven. The flood came. The text describes its violence. The Anunnaki raised their torches, lighting the land with their glare. The stillness that came from the storm, God Adad passed over the sky. All that was bright turned to darkness. The destruction was total. For 7 days and 7 nights, water covered the earth. Every human settlement was obliterated. Every terrestrial creature not on the boat drowned. And then something unexpected happened. The gods regretted their decision. The text describes the goddess Ishtar crying out in anguish, "How could I, before the gods, declare evil in the assembly? I myself declared war to destroy my people. I have given birth to my people. Where are they now? They fill the sea like fish." The other gods wept with her. They realized they had destroyed the workforce that sustained them. No more sacrifices, no more temples maintained, no more food offerings. The gods began to starve. When Atrahasis finally emerged from the boat and offered sacrifice, the text says the gods smelled the savour. The gods smelled the sweet savour. The gods crowded like flies about the sacrificer. This is not dignified divine behaviour. This is desperation. The gods needed humans. They had nearly destroyed their own sustenance system. Enlil, discovering that humans had survived, was furious. He demanded to know which god had violated the oath. Enki's response is worth quoting in full. "I did not reveal the secret of the great gods. To Atrahasis I showed a dream, and thus he learned the secret of the gods. This is legal defence. Enki technically did not violate the letter of the oath. He did not reveal the secret directly. He employed a technicality, speaking to a wall, which Atrahasis overheard, that preserved the form while subverting the intent. The assembly debated. Enlil accused Enki of betrayal. Enki defended his actions as preserving the cosmic order. Eliminating humanity entirely would have destabilized the system that depended on them. Eventually, a compromise was reached. Humanity would survive, but new regulations would limit population growth. The goddess Nintu, who had created humans, decreed the limitations: barrenness for some women, infant mortality for some births, demons who would snatch babies, priestesses forbidden to bear children. These were not curses. The text frames them as administrative adjustments, population controls implemented through modifications to human reproduction. The decision was formalized, the new parameters were encoded, and the crisis was resolved. What does this extended narrative reveal about Anunnaki governance? First, major decisions followed a formal process. Enlil did not simply decree the flood. He brought the proposal to the assembly. The assembly debated. A vote was taken. Even the destruction of all human life required collective authorization. Second, dissent was possible even after a vote. Enki disagreed with the decision, and though he was bound by the assembly's oath, he found a way to preserve his principles while technically complying with the letter of the law. The system tolerated this form of dissent. Third, decisions were irreversible once implemented, but their consequences could be mitigated. The flood could not be stopped once authorized, but its outcome could be modified through clever intervention. Fourth, the gods were not omniscient. They did not foresee that eliminating humanity would undermine their own interests. They made a decision, discovered it was wrong, and had to negotiate a correction. This fallibility is remarkable in texts about divine beings. Fifth, oaths had binding power even on gods. When Enlil bound the assembly with an oath not to warn humanity, that oath was effective. Enki had to work around it rather than simply breaking it. Oaths were not merely moral commitments, they were cosmic constraints. Sixth, the system self-corrected. The gods' mistake, nearly destroying humanity, was rectified not through external intervention, but through internal negotiation. The same assembly that authorized the flood negotiated the terms of humanity's survival. What we are witnessing is democratic process under cosmic stakes, imperfect decision-making by a collective body, followed by adaptation and adjustment when reality revealed the flaws in their choice. This is not how divine governance is usually portrayed in ancient texts. In most traditions, gods are presented as wise, infallible, or at least consistent, but the Mesopotamian texts present the Anunnaki as powerful beings operating within a system that constrained them, making decisions through collective deliberation, and sometimes making mistakes that required correction. The flood narrative is often read as a moral story about divine judgment on human wickedness, but the Atrahasis epic is explicit. Humanity was not destroyed for sin. They were destroyed for noise, for disturbing the gods' rest. The decision was pragmatic, not moral, and it was reversed when the gods realized the pragmatic consequences were unacceptable. This pragmatism appears throughout Mesopotamian divine governance. Decisions were made based on functional necessity, not abstract ethics. When a decision proved dysfunctional, it was modified. The system valued stability and sustainability over ideological purity, but the system also valued procedural legitimacy. Enki's dissent had to be expressed through legal manoeuvring rather than open defiance. He respected the assembly's authority even while subverting its intent. This suggests that procedural legitimacy mattered more than unanimous agreement. The system could tolerate internal opposition as long as that opposition was expressed through proper channels. The flood decision also reveals something about the relationship between divine law and cosmic function. The assembly could vote to destroy humanity, but they could not vote to eliminate the consequences of that destruction. Once humans were gone, sacrifices ceased, temples fell into disrepair, the gods suffered. This suggests that certain consequences were built into the structure of reality itself. The gods could make choices, but they could not choose the consequences of those choices. Cause and effect operated mechanically regardless of divine will, which again points to a cosmos governed by law rather than by arbitrary divine decree. The Anunnaki had authority to make decisions within the system, but they could not override the system's fundamental logic. And when they tried, when they voted to eliminate a component of the cosmic order that they themselves had integrated into that order, they discovered that the system pushed back, not through punishment, but through natural consequence. The gods went hungry. They realized their mistake. They corrected it. This is governance, not mythology. This is a record of powerful beings making decisions through institutional process, discovering the limits of their authority through experimentation, and adapting to realities they could not simply command away. And the fact that these accounts were preserved and recopied for thousands of years suggests they were not entertainment. They were documentation, training materials perhaps, case studies in how cosmic governance worked and what happened when proper procedure was followed or violated. The Sumerians were teaching something to future generations, something about how power functioned in a universe governed by law, something about the difference between authority and wisdom, between the power to make decisions and the capacity to make them well, and something about the persistence of systems that outlast any individual administrator, even administrators as powerful as gods. Beneath the surface of the archive, the vault is quiet. The temperature is carefully controlled to preserve clay that was shaped by human hands 5,000 years ago. The tablets sit in rows, catalogued, translated, accessible to anyone with the will to read them. They are not hidden. They are not suppressed. They are, in fact, available for free online through databases maintained by Oxford, the University of Pennsylvania, and museums across Europe and the Middle East. And yet, they are invisible. Because the interpretation we have been taught, that these are myths, allegories, primitive attempts to explain natural phenomena, prevents us from seeing what the texts actually say. Seen through that interpretive lens, the Sumerian tablets are quaint. Interesting from an anthropological perspective, proof of human creativity and our ancestors' struggle to make sense of a mysterious world. But if you set that lens aside, if you read the tablets as their creators appear to have written them, as records, as documentation, as administrative archives, a different picture emerges. You see beings called the Anunnaki, who wield extraordinary power but operate within strict procedural constraints. You see a cosmic governance system with separation of powers, jurisdictional boundaries, voting procedures, and constitutional limitations. You see physical objects, the ME, the Tablet of Destinies, that grant access to administrative functions within a reality that behaves like a programmed system. You see laws that bind even gods. And you see documentation of that system's operation maintained with legal precision across centuries. If these texts are mythology, they are mythology of a very strange kind. They lack the qualities that typically characterize mythological thinking. They are not primarily concerned with morality. They do not provide easy answers to existential questions. They do not make their divine characters consistently noble or wise. They do not resolve into clear symbolic meanings. Instead, they read like procedural manuals, like meeting minutes, like legal case studies analysing how authority was exercised, what happened when protocols were violated, and how the system self-corrected. This doesn't prove the texts are historical in the conventional sense, but it does suggest they were documenting something the Sumerians believed was real, something they observed functioning according to consistent rules, something they felt obligated to record accurately. What if the Sumerians were not inventing gods? What if they were documenting governors? Not governors in our limited political sense, but in a more fundamental meaning, entities who governed the operation of reality itself, who administered territories, maintained infrastructure, allocated resources, and enforced protocols that kept the cosmos functioning. That interpretation makes sense of details that are otherwise puzzling. It explains why the texts are so concerned with jurisdiction, procedure, and proper form. It explains why divine power is presented as constrained and conditional rather than absolute. It explains why the tablets meticulously document assembly votes, territorial boundaries, and the consequences of protocol violations. And it raises the question that has run beneath this entire investigation. If the Anunnaki were governors rather than creators, who established the government they were governing? The texts are clear that the ME system predated the Anunnaki's administration of it. The jurisdictional boundaries were already established. The assembly procedures were already in place. The Tablet of Destinies existed as an instrument of authority before any particular god wielded it. The Anunnaki inherited a cosmic operating system. They learned to use it. They became expert administrators, but they did not design it. Someone, or something, created a cosmos that could be governed, that had built-in protocols for decision-making, resource allocation, and conflict resolution. That distributed authority in a way that prevented absolute tyranny. That included self-correcting mechanisms to maintain stability even when individual administrators made poor decisions. Who builds a universe with those characteristics? The mainstream academic answer is nobody. The Sumerians invented these elaborate theological systems to make sense of natural phenomena and to legitimize human political structures by projecting them onto the divine realm. But that answer assumes the conclusion. It assumes the texts are mythology, then uses that assumption to dismiss any evidence that might suggest otherwise. What if we remain agnostic about what the texts represent? What if we simply examine what they say about how the system functioned, regardless of whether that system was real? The picture that emerges is of a cosmos governed by law, not by the arbitrary will of all-powerful beings, but by protocols that constrain even the most powerful. A cosmos where authority is distributed, conditional, and subject to review, where violations of proper procedure have automatic consequences, where the system as a whole is more important than any individual administrator. This is sophisticated political philosophy. It anticipates concepts that would not emerge in Western thought until millennia later. Constitutional limits on power, separation of powers, rule of law rather than rule by decree, the distinction between legitimate and illegitimate authority. Either the Sumerians were extraordinary political theorists who invented these concepts in the 3rd millennium BC and encoded them in their religious texts, or they were documenting something they observed. Both possibilities should unsettle us. If they invented these concepts, why did subsequent civilizations abandon them? Why did monarchy by divine right become the norm rather than the constitutional oligarchy the Sumerians described? Why does the sophisticated understanding of power evident in cuneiform tablets disappear from later traditions? If they were documenting something they observed, what were they observing? What kind of reality would produce these accounts? The texts offer clues. The Anunnaki are described as physical beings. They eat, they drink, they sleep, they die. The gods in Gilgamesh fear death. Dumuzi, Inanna's husband, dies and must spend part of each year in the underworld. Divine beings are powerful, long-lived, but not eternal. They are vulnerable, and they are bound by rules they did not create. This suggests a cosmos with multiple layers of authority. Human kings ruled under the authority of city gods. City gods ruled under the authority of the Anunnaki assembly. The assembly operated within the constraints of the ME system. And the ME system itself, the texts never say where it came from. That silence is perhaps the most revealing detail of all. Imagine you are a Sumerian scribe. You have spent years learning to read and write cuneiform. You have studied the ancient texts. You know the stories of the Anunnaki, the flood, the transfer of kingship, the acquisition of the ME. You know these stories are important enough that you and scribes like you have been copying them for generations. If someone asked you where the ME came from originally, what would you say? If you believed you were writing mythology, you would invent an origin story. You would say Anu created them at the beginning, or Enki discovered them in the Absu, or they emerged from the primordial chaos. But the texts don't say that. They simply present the ME as existing, already there, already structured, already operational. That silence suggests the scribes did not know, or knew they did not know, and rather than inventing an answer, they recorded what they had, accounts of how the system functioned, who administered it, and what happened when its protocols were violated. They preserved the operational manual, but they never claimed to have the design specifications, which leaves us, 4,000 years later, reading clay tablets in museum vaults, trying to understand what our ancestors were trying to preserve. The most common interpretation, that these are myths, requires us to believe the Sumerians were engaged in elaborate imaginative fiction that they nonetheless treated with legal precision and documentary rigour. The alternative, that they were documenting something real, requires us to expand our understanding of what real might mean. Were the Anunnaki physical beings, interdimensional entities, metaphysical principles anthropomorphized, something else entirely? The texts do not resolve that question. They only insist, with remarkable consistency across thousands of years, that there were laws that governed even gods, laws administered by beings more powerful than humans, but less powerful than the framework within which they operated. And those laws were not invented by the administrators, they were inherited. From what source the tablets never say, only that the source was ancient, that it predated the oldest stories, that it established the protocols through which reality could be managed but not mastered, and that those protocols were still in effect when the last cuneiform tablet was written in the 1st century of the Common Era, nearly 3,000 years after the first Sumerian cities rose from the floodplain. 3,000 years of consistency, 3,000 years of scribes preserving accounts of how cosmic governance functioned, 3,000 years of documentation maintained with legal precision. What were they trying to preserve? What did they think we needed to know? Perhaps only this, that power, even at the highest levels, operates within constraints. That authority requires legitimacy, not just strength. That the universe may be less arbitrary and more structured than we imagine, and that somewhere in the deep foundations of reality there are laws that even gods must follow, laws whose origin remains to this day unexplained. You're lying in the darkness now, whether in a quiet bedroom in Copenhagen, or a city apartment in Buenos Aires, or somewhere in between, and the question remains hanging in the air like dust in lamplight: what were the Sumerians trying to tell us? Not about aliens or ancient astronauts. The texts never make those claims. Not about the Anunnaki as creators, they are always presented as administrators, but about a cosmos that functions according to law, about power that is real but constrained, about a system of governance that predates the governors. The clay tablets are still there, available, waiting, documenting procedures and violations and consequences with the dry precision of legal archives. If they are mythology, they are remarkably restrained mythology. No cosmic battles between good and evil, no ultimate triumph of order over chaos, just endless administration, meetings, votes, jurisdictional disputes, protocol violations, negotiations, compromises. If they are something else, records, documentation, preserved accounts of something that actually functioned, then we are left with the most profound mystery the tablets pose. Who designed a cosmos with laws that even gods could not override? The answer, if there is one, is not in the tablets we have. Perhaps it was never written down. Perhaps it was lost. Perhaps it exists on tablets still buried beneath the Iraqi desert, waiting for excavation that may never come. Or perhaps the answer was never in written form at all. Perhaps it exists at a level of reality the Sumerians could observe but not directly access. The deep code underlying the operating system, visible only through its effects. The Anunnaki, if we take the text at their word, had high-level access. They could execute commands, they could transfer authorities, they could modify parameters within their jurisdiction, but they could not rewrite the fundamental architecture. That architecture, the ME system, the jurisdictional boundaries, the procedural requirements, the self-correcting mechanisms, was designed by someone else. And whoever designed it understood governance at a level we are only beginning to grasp. They built a cosmos that could be administered but not tyrannized. They distributed power so no single entity could dominate absolutely. They embedded checks and balances into the structure of reality itself. And then they gave the administrative keys to the Anunnaki and stepped back into silence. If you found something in this investigation worth carrying into your sleep, you might leave a comment. Share where you're listening from, what time zone you're in, as you drift off to these ancient questions. There's something fitting about considering Sumerian archives in the darkness. Their scribes wrote by lamplight too, pressing wedge-shaped symbols into clay, preserving what they thought we needed to know. What they preserved was not answers, it was evidence. Evidence of a system, evidence of law, evidence of governance extending beyond the human realm into something larger, older, more carefully structured than we typically imagine when we think about gods. The tablets are still here 4 millennia later, making their quiet claim that reality operates according to protocols. That power requires legitimacy, that even at the cosmic level there are rules, and that somewhere, in foundations we cannot see, there is an architecture we did not build. The investigation continues in archives across the world. The clay tablets wait, patient as stone, holding secrets that resist easy interpretation. But they hold them still, preserved in the darkness of museum vaults, waiting for questions we have not yet learned to ask. Sleep well.